Hey everyone, Chaps here, and this is the new Prusa Mk4 or Mark 4 or whatever you want to call it. In this video, we're going to be unboxing the kit and stepping through the assembly. Or if you'd rather, I have shorter videos linked below that are going to be walking through each of the main chapters. As always with my videos, I've got timestamps down there so you can skip around as needed. And I've also got links to the online assembly manual as well if you want to follow along there, or if you're trying to assemble it yourself. There's actually a lot of user comments that go along with the online assembly, and it probably would have made the process a little bit easier for me rather than using the printed manual. So let's get this started with the unboxing. Something to note here is that while I have two static cameras set up for this build that I'll flip in between, my main priority was the build, not the camera angles, so some of the views may not be the best. I'm glad I had this decent sized table to use for the assembly, because as you'll see, there are a ton of parts, and I really make use of this full table. Most parts are shipped in these categorized boxes. I figured that my best course of action was to separate each of these boxes and then open each and sort the bags that are in each box. It's all nicely labeled, so it was easy to sort the X-axis, Z-axis, electronics, Y parts, and so on. I built a Mark III kit years ago, so I'm familiar with the basics, so I skipped over the beginning of this instruction manual. So now we're onto the frame. For each step, they tell you what hardware and what parts are going to be used, so I try to get those out in advance. The first step is attaching the base onto these vertical frames. I'm dumb and somehow messed up this first step and put these in the wrong spot. So let me take those off and correct them. And now we can get to the shorter legs. As with almost any assembly, using a star or diagonal pattern is a must. Get all of the pieces mostly tightened, then go back around and crisscross pattern for final tightening. The next step is installing these square nuts that slide along the side of the extrusions. They only fit in one direction, so they're easy to slide in. We can then go ahead and add the end plates. We'll add the short one and then the long one. Up next are some rubber feet, which should help dampen some vibrations a bit. We push them into place and rotate 90 degrees to lock them in. These stupid cable clips are next, and man, they gave me a hard time. It's much nicer than zip ties, but I really hated these. You put one side in place and then press hard, like really hard, to snap the other side into place. And I'm guessing that one of the reasons I hate them is because, yes, even though we've just barely begun, I've already made another mistake. I put these on the wrong side and had to take them off it to redo it. Luckily, the pictures in the guide helped me catch that pretty quickly. From here, we add the PSU. Some screws get added to the sliding nuts that we put in, and then the PSU slides into place over top of them. It can then be screwed into the vertical frame and tightened down, both from the frame and from the sliding screws. Next is the so-called buddy box that holds the buddy board, or the main circuit board. We begin by installing the box to the other side of the printer, basically the same process as the PSU, where you put it on the sliding nuts and then screw it into the frame. We can then add some thermal adhesive to the back of the board, flip the printer on its side, and place the board down in place. It then gets attached by 5 screws. At this point, we get out the X-axis holder, which is used later in assembly. It was designed with a special curve to help guide some zip ties into position around the buddy board. While we don't really need the zip ties until quite a while later, I guess they figure you might as well add them now. As a side note, our cat loved playing with them while I was between build sessions because they're just sort of sticking out the side. After getting the printer back upright, we can look at the Y-belt idler. We push a nut into position and then we screw it down to the frame. We then move to the Y motor. A few nuts get pushed into the motor holder, and then the holder gets screwed to the motor. From here, we attach the drive pulley. Using an Allen key, we can place the pulley at the right spot before tightening the grub screw. As a warning, I actually had this pulley flipped upside down, and I'll fix that later. With the thermal adhesive in place, which I assume just acts as a shock absorber, we can screw the motor into the frame. And there we go. The frame is basically done. In total, that took about an hour and 40 minutes. With the frame fully assembled, we can now hop into the X-axis. We begin by getting the X-end idler and the motor mount. These have a ton of nuts that need to be inserted. By this point, you're hopefully pretty used to the various techniques to use to insert them. Now let's get out some bearings and their clips. The bearings in this kit need to be lubricated, so there's an included tube and some adapters. Here we're going to use the larger black adapter. It screws onto the tube, is pushed into the bearing, and rotated into position so that it pushes lube out of some tiny channels onto the ball bearings. It seems to work okay, but it's not really the most elegant process. I feel like this is something that could probably be improved in the process later. After doing this for both bearings, we look at clipping them into place. We place it in the motor mount and rotate it so that the ball rows are aligned properly, and then a rubber pad is put in this cover to help the bearing from rotating. The lid is then slid over the bearing and tightened down. As usual, it's tightened in a diagonal pattern. This process is then repeated for the X-idler mount. We put the bearing in place, get it oriented properly, slide the lid over, and we tighten it down with the X pattern. Next up, we take the 2 longest steel rods and 3 of the shorter bearings. These get marked to help us remember the orientation of the ball bearings. Then, basically just as with the previous bearings, they get lubed up, this time using the smaller orange adapter. We can then push the 2 rods into the X-end idler. It takes a bit of force, but pushing on the table worked out pretty well. The bearings are then slide into place, but make sure you note the direction and orientation, like you put 2 bearings on one side and 1 bearing on the other. And with those on, we can slide the X motor mount onto the other side of the rods. For now, the X-axis can get set aside and we move to the X-carriage. Again, we have a ton of nuts that need to get embedded in this one. Just use the Allen key with various push and pull methods to get them in place. And after that, we'll add a few hex spacers as well. The carriage clip is next and receives a few rubber pads. Just as with the other pads we use, these will help hold the bearings in the right orientation. With those pushed down into place, we'll spin the bearings so that they're lined up properly, and we'll put the cover on to tighten the screws. Next, we grab the X-axis motor. This gets mounted to the motor mount, similarly to the Y motor. Use the Allen key to align the pulley, and then tighten down the grub screw. From here, we get the idler pulley and the X belt. With the bolt wrapped around the pulley, we can pull the pulley into the idler and slide and push a pin through it. Man, I said pull and pulley a lot there. By pulling on this belt, the pin seats into place. Now we'll push one end of the belt into the carriage. I like to use an Allen key to get it fully seated in there. The other end gets passed through the carriage, wrapped around the drive pulley, and then back to the carriage. It can then be pushed into place. Don't worry about the tension right now. It should be somewhat tight, but it gets fully tightened later. The last step for this X-axis is to fully tighten the carriage clip into place. And bam, the X-axis and carriage are complete. That took about an hour and 45 minutes, bringing us to a total of 3 hours and 25 minutes. With the X-axis all assembled, let's go ahead and start grabbing some parts for the Z-axis. We're going to start with the bottom left and right brackets. Using a few screws, we'll screw them into place. And there's a little lip on the side to help ensure that they fit into the right spot and to make sure that they're on the right side. Now we can get out the Z motors and the attached screw drives. We'll also need to add some rubber pads at this time. There's a few plastic nuts in this box as well, and they just recommend putting them aside so that you don't lose them. The motors get mounted to the underside of the mounting brackets. The longer cable should be on the side opposite of the buddy board. And I guess I'll mention that the rubber pads are placed over the motor before we screw them down. At this point, we can tighten them most of the way, but we need to leave a little slack for some of the next steps. First though, we'll feed the wires into place, under the frame, and up to the buddy box slots. Now those trapezoidal nuts come into play, along with 2 more metal rods. This time we use the 2 shortest, which are also the largest in diameter. We'll go ahead and push them down into place. And there's even a little viewport in the motor mounts to help you make sure that they're pushed in all the way. From here, get the X-axis assembly and slide it down over the rods. The plastic X-axis holder now comes into play, and it's used to hold the assembly up near the top of the printer. With this being held up here, we can now see how the threaded rods stick up through the X-axis brackets. It's up near the top, so any small changes in angle cause a large amount of movement. This gives us the opportunity to tighten the Z-motor screws. We want to get them nice and tight, but we may need to back off slightly on some of them in order to ensure that the screw is centered in this hole. We can now move on to screwing in the trapezoidal nuts. They screw onto the threaded rods and down into the holes on the X-axis assembly. Tightening the screws down on these nuts now lock the Z-axis height to the X-axis assembly. So really, we can remove the X holder if we want. I mean, I didn't. I probably should have, but I waited until a little bit later. Up next, we have a couple end caps that go over the Z-rods. These go over the top and screw into the frame. I had a bunch of trouble with one of these, so I put a screw in from the back to ensure that the frame was threaded out nicely. And yeah, sorry about some of the camera angles. I should have used a wide angle option on the phone, but again, assembly was priority, not recording. With this assembly all in place, it's time to hook up some of the controls for the X-axis. We'll need to go to the so-called LoveBoard, and also this large extruder cable. The cable gets passed through the axis and up into a channel in the carriage. We then plug it into the LoveBoard, and then we push the LoveBoard down to its slot on the carriage. From there, it gets screwed into place, and I do a bit of cable management. Okay, so now we want to set up some parts so that the cables can feed from the LoveBoard down to the buddy box. We start with a large screw going through this cable holder. Next we grab the nylon strand and this back cover. We'll go ahead and place one of the rubber pads onto this back cover, which will prevent the bearings from rotating. And now the nylon gets pushed through the little hole to hold it in place. After ensuring that no wires are pinched, the back cover can be screwed on and that bearing can be held into place. I didn't quite have one of the inserted nuts on the carriage pulled in all the way, so my screw didn't quite reach. Luckily, I could just use one of the longer ones to pull it tight, and then go back with the correct screw. From here, it's a part that I always hate for some reason, and that's using the cable sleeve. We'll use the largest of the 3 cable sleeves and wrap this bundle of cables up. After getting it started, this cover gets placed on and zip tied down. Spoiler alert, these zip ties gave me some trouble in the future. Make sure they're tight, and make sure they're rotated properly. So from here, we just finish wrapping up the sleeve, and after grabbing a few other parts here, it's time to wrap up the X motor cable, which is much shorter and easier. Now it's time to move on to this cable holder that brings the newly sleeved cables together. We'll push a few nuts in them, and then we'll use the nylon to lock the larger bundle into place. Next, the smaller bundle gets passed over top and placed in its spot. From here we can screw down the top of the cable holder. This clamps down on the sleeves and keeps everything in place. A zip tie is then used to clamp down further on one of the extensions, and honestly I'm not entirely sure why that was needed. But now we can slot this into the buddy box and tighten it down. The cables are left unattached for now, and with that, the Z-axis, and I guess the X-axis wiring, are completed. That took another hour and 45 minutes, bringing us to a total of 5 hours and 10 minutes so far on the build. Alright, with the X-axis and Z-axis all assembled, we can begin on the Nextruder. The printer can be set aside for now, as we'll be focused on this sub-assembly for a little bit. We start with the filament sensor assembly. I wasted so much time here searching for this steel ball, which turns out it was just in a different bag than what I was expecting. Okay, so all the parts in place, this filament sensor gets screwed into place on the heatsink. We can then assemble the spring-loaded ball that assists the sensor. The ball gets stuck to a magnet, which then gets put on the spring. This assembly is then pressed into a slot on the heatsink. We can set that aside for now and start grabbing parts for the idler assembly. This is just 2 small bearings that get sandwiched between the 2 halves of the idler lever. When tightening it down though, we need to make sure that the idler bearings can still spin freely, so don't go too tight. The spacer then gets pushed on one end, which will basically act as a pivot later. Okay, so now the main extruder part. We'll need the planetary gear, the housing, and the motor. The heatsink gets placed on top of the motor, and then this plate gets set on top. We can then take the planetary gearbox assembly adapter, and we use that to pick up the gearbox. The adapter is basically just a specialized printed part to help with alignment. With it picked up, we can now press it into place. This step also took me much longer than it should have. I was just trying to be overly cautious, I think. Also, the lighting I was in made it really hard to see the chamfered edge on the ring, and I feel like they probably could have marked that ring a little bit better. Eventually I got it on, about 10 minutes later, and I placed it on the motor. The guide was adamant about making sure it was aligned properly, so I actually took it back off and did it again just to be safe. From here, the idler gets added and the screw is inserted. Next, it's time to lube up the gearbox. I used one of the small Allen keys, but it actually recommends using the tip of a zip tie. Basically, just go around all of the teeth of all of the gears. We can now take the gearbox cover and screw it into place to close things up. I saw an idea online about printing a clear cover for this, and I really wish Prusa had done that by default. They made such a big deal out of this the Nextruder Assembly, and then they cover it up. Oh well. We can put this assembly to the side for now and move on to the other half of the idler. We'll get a bunch of tiny little pieces here and attach them with some spacers in between to make a swiveling part. And as with any swiveling part, just don't over tighten it or else it's not going to rotate. We can now take the springs and put them on the screws, push them through the motor bracket, and screw them into the idler. It's hard to gauge how tight these are due to the spring's resistance, but they tell you to tighten it until just the tip of the screw reaches the front of the idler nut. From here we can start preparing to attach the heatsink and prepare for the nozzle. The thermistor gets attached with a single grub screw. We'll also put 2 thumb screws on which will hold the nozzle in place. This whole assembly can now be placed on the X-Carriage, and with 3 screws, it's now in place. With this all together, we can take some time to do some cable management. There's a channel on the carriage that we'll use to guide the cables up so that they don't get pinched. Now comes the hot end fan. it gets 2 screws to hold it in place, and then the cable gets fed up the LoveBoard and plugged into its labeled slot. The nozzle and hot end assembly is next, which is a cool change from the previous designs. This just slides right up into place and then gets secured by tightening the 2 thumb screws. Once secured, we'll do a little bit more cable management, feeding stuff up through the guide channel. This next step is assembling the hinged print fan assembly. There's 2 small magnets, one of which gets pushed into a slot on the fan door. The fan door then gets laid down and the fan cable sits nicely into a channel on it. Folding the fan over clamps the cable down into its channel, and we can secure it with a couple of screws. Next, the fan shroud goes into place, which is what will direct the air towards the printed part. As I started tightening this, I realized that the cable was actually getting sandwiched a bit and wasn't properly seated in its channel, so I just unscrewed stuff and reseated it and screwed it back together. From here, we take the other small magnet. It gets a little mark to indicate which side is attracted to the fan door, and then it gets pushed into place on the X-Carriage. I ended up using an Allen key to push it further down to make sure it was fully seated. You really want to use that mark because if you happen to get that turned around backwards, I don't know if there's any way to really get it back out. The fan door then gets put in position by aligning the hinges, and a screw is used to hold it in place. The screw door now swings freely, and the magnet will help keep it closed. I did notice a bit of resistance from pushing against the cables, but it wasn't too much of an issue. Speaking of which, the extruder cable and the filament sensor can now get attached, as well as the print fan cable. The idler is now locked into place, which was honestly really satisfying. All that's left now are a couple of covers. We'll start with the right side LoveBoard cable cover. I hate this part. It's just held by 1 screw, and I really don't like the way it's seated or the tolerances with it. It probably doesn't help that I thought it was the cause of some of my issues later on, which it ended up it wasn't, but I'm still not a fan of it. After screwing that on and cleaning up some of the cables, the LoveBoard can be slid down into place. There's some pretty tight tolerances here, so I'm also not too fond of this one, but it is much better than the old design, I guess. I'll also note that it does seem to flex a bit when I open and close the fan door due to some of the cables getting pulled. The final step here is to tune the belt tension. There's a nice app to assist with this. For right now, I just get it close enough. I'm going to tune it more later. With that, the Nextruder assembly is completed. That took an hour and 50 minutes, and it's bringing us to a total of 7 hours even, though we certainly had some inefficiencies along the way that could have been much lower. And I'll make a note here to keep in mind that, again, I have 2 static cameras set up for this build that I'm going to flip between, but my main priority was the build, not the camera angle. So some of the views in this video are not the best. I just want you to keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're on to the LCD, which is a nice upgrade from the basic screen of the Mk4. This is actually split into 2 sections that depend on which screen you have. I have version A, so that's where I'm going to focus here. We're going to start by grabbing a bunch of parts, which makes me really thankful for the way that Prusa organized the bags. The first step is to insert some nuts into the LCD supports. We can then take this reflector sticker and attach it to the bottom of the cover. The right side LCD support can then get placed on the board and it's pressed into the LCD cover. The support then gets screwed on. Next, the grounding cable bracket gets screwed into place, and we can then look at screwing on the left side LCD support. From here, the LCD cable and the grounding cable are plugged into the board, at which point we can now skip ahead as the next few steps are for version B of the board. The LCD board gets flipped over and the input knob can get pushed on. It's now time to attach the screen to the frame. We pass the cables under the frame and push the brackets into position. We can then come up from the back and use 4 screws to tighten the brackets to the frame. Cable management is next as we feed the LCD cables along the inside of the frame. We'll now move on to the PSU. This is best if we flip the printer over on the side. Now we go in with some power cables and we hook them to the terminal screws on the PSU. Make sure you connect these to the right leads or else bad things could happen, I guess. We also add this panic cable, which I'm not really sure what it's for, but I'm guessing it's a safety thing. And yeah, give me a break. I have degrees in mechanical and aerospace engineering. All this electrical stuff is like voodoo magic to me, man. Alright, so with these wires all hooked up, the next step is to add the PSU cover, which just takes a couple of screws. And then the cables are fed through some of the cable clips to join their friends. Again, apologies for some of the camera angles here. The next step was to zip tie this Z-motor cable into position. I honestly don't know why we had to do this one, and I don't feel like the instructions were super clear on how this was done, but hey, I managed. And this next part was really a pain. It's just all about cable management. We walked the group of cables down the frame, zip tying them occasionally, and I actually missed a couple and had to go redo a few. I guess it's important to pay attention. or at least double check yourself occasionally. With that completed, we can get to the nightmare of cable management in the buddy box. It's not too bad with just first attaching the PSU and grounding cables. The zip tie job they want you to do on some of the other cables is a bit odd though, and I certainly didn't get it perfectly the way they wanted. But I guess it's a matter of just being good enough. As long as the cables aren't in the way and they're not dragging on the table, everything should be fine. I'm not going to walk you through every single cable, partially because there's a lot of them, and secondly because they're important to get right, so I'm not exactly the one that you should be listening to about that. And maybe most importantly, you likely don't want to stare at shots of my back for the next 10 minutes. But hey, look, I got them all in there. And oops, I'm blocking it again. But yeah, there it is. It's all hooked up. Electronics completed. Well, mostly. This was a short chapter here, but that was an agonizing hour and 40 minutes. And that brings us to a total of 8 hours and 40 minutes thus far, which, again, lots of mistakes and inefficiencies along the way. Probably should be a lot less than 8 hours 40 minutes. So hey, all that's left now is this y-axis, so let's get started. We start by getting out our heater plate and some of the cables. We'll attach some of these wires and the connectors to their plate. They use a wrench from one side and the Allen key from the other, which can be kind of annoying. It makes me wish I had 3 hands, but once it's in place, we can angle them towards each other and tighten it down. Now let's get out some of the pieces and prepare the cover. It was actually sort of a pain to get these nuts in place. I tried the pull-through method, but I was really struggling. I ended up using the surface of the pliers as a hard, flat surface to press against. So this nylon gets pushed into a hole in the cover, and the wires are fed through the center hole. It actually took me a really long time, but I eventually got it screwed down. But now we come in with the cable sleeve and get it all twisted up. And let's pop the top cover in to clamp it all down. We're now pulling out the Y-carriage, some bearings, and some clips and pads. We'll start by wiping off the bearings and greasing them up. So we've done this a few times throughout the process now, and this is the last one, and I'm still honestly not a fan of this greasing process. I feel like my adapter just wasn't working properly. I think I eventually got enough lube in there, but it seemed like it just was coming out of the bottom more than coming out of the actual holes in the adapter. So with those bearings out of the way, let's go on and assemble the pads to their clips. We'll start by screwing those into the carriage. The first one was a little tight, but I got it to work. This other one on the other side, oh man, this was a pain, and I'm still actually kind of worried about it. I think that the carriage may have not been threaded properly, and I may have ended up cross-threading it. You'll see throughout this I use a couple of screws, take them in and out, I try from the other side, and I even get another Allen wrench in an attempt to stop the slippage. This was a huge pain, but I eventually got through it, sorta. I took the lazy route as I wasn't in the mood for fixing things at the time, but honestly, if you run into a part that's hard to thread, you should just take the clip off and try a screw by itself. You can do it from either side. Once the bearings are loosely in place, we'll slide the rods on and tighten things down. And again, this is where I ran into some serious issues trying to tighten that one screw down, but I eventually got it, I think, hopefully, and we can then put the carriage on the frame. We'll loosely attach it on either side, and then the back. And after ensuring everything works smoothly, we'll tighten it down and pinch the holder shut with some extra screws. We can now move on to the belt. After pushing some nuts into place, we'll push the belt into one side of the holder. It's then time to attach this to the underside of the carriage. Next, we're going to feed it through the driver pulley and out the other side. We can now attach the belt to the other bracket, and feed the whole thing through the pulley on the front end. This next part was sort of a pain, and it's attaching that second bracket to the carriage. The belt is sort of tight at this point, so it takes some trial and error to get it on. Unfortunately, even once it was on for me, things weren't quite right. The next step was to look at the belt and ensure it's centered, and mine definitely was not. I'm not sure how I missed this, but I actually installed the Y motor pulley upside down, thus it's being a little bit off-center. I tried fixing it without taking the belt and brackets completely off, but that wasn't going to happen. I ended up just taking the belt back off, flipping the pulley, and getting it nicely lined up. From here, we can start getting the heater plate ready. We'll start by adding these expansion joints. Next, we add a spacer followed by the heater plate, which just gets screwed on. So you start with the center one loosely, then go sort of diagonal pattern around the outside, and then go back and tighten all of them up nicely. Now we can move on to the wiring. The braided cable gets fed into the buddy box and a cover clamps it into place. We can then screw in a few cables and assure that everything fits properly. The Mark IV comes with a Wi-Fi adapter this time, so now is when we can hook that up. Apparently it's pretty slow, but hey, it's better than nothing. We're almost done with the buddy box now. We'll just put a bottom cover on, then a side cover, and then bam, it's all closed up. The spool holder is next, which honestly doesn't require any instructions to assemble. The filament guide comes after that, which has a surprising number of parts. There's some nylon inserts, some screws, and then some nuts to hold them in place, and then some screws to hold the guide to the spool holder. It's a nice addition, but honestly, this part was way more complicated than it needed to be. And I guess all that's left now is adding the print plate. And bam, 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the printer is fully assembled. If you've added up all the time so far, that brings us to a total of 11 hours and 20 minutes. I'll say that likely should have been closer to maybe 8 hours for someone semi-experienced and not terrible at this, and maybe 10 hours to somebody who's new and again not terrible at this. But paying attention to the camera, or at least trying to occasionally, and some of my bonehead mistakes, and me just being straight up terrible at using this Allen wrench, probably added quite a lot of time here. So with that assembled, I'm going to clear out some space and move the printer over to an outlet. And of course, I'll pick up the camera and move that over for you all. Alright, so here we go, the first boot up. It checks the axes, then wants me to tap the nozzle to confirm that the string gauge used for first layer calibration is working, and then it checks the fans and heaters. Then being this is the first startup, it wants to do some adjustments to the Nextruder. I'm not really sure what that's all about, but hey, let it do its thing. So we have to unscrew it slightly, and then let it do its stuff, and then tighten everything back up. Alright, lastly, it's a filament sensor check, and bam, we're done. Well, except for the fact that I failed the x-axis. Here I go through some troubleshooting trying to figure it out. I thought it was this cable holder, or this cable management thing on the right side of the buddy box, but I fixed that and it still failed. Turns out it was actually this zip tie on the back end. So I had to tighten that down a little bit more, rotate it into position, make sure I clipped off any excess, and after getting that all squared away, I gave it another go. This time, thankfully it all passes. I put in the included flash drive, and well, first off, it's a really tight fit, which I've read from people online. If it's hard to put in, I say maybe just scrap the included flash drive and use your own. But not only was it a tight fit, but it wasn't even being recognized. So I ran upstairs, got a new flash drive, and tried to put that one in. But it didn't work either. So it turns out some of the pins on my LCD board got bent. Maybe it bent while I was trying to force the flash drive in there. Or maybe it just shipped that way. I've seen a few other people online with that issue as well. Luckily, Prusa support is amazing, and they shipped out a new one. For now, we're going to assume that all works out great. I'm not going to delay putting out these videos until the new board arrives. And I'm sure you're going to find out soon enough as I start doing some more 3D printing videos again. So yeah, that wraps up this video and the build of the Prusa Mk4. Hopefully you enjoyed this build process along the way. It was interesting trying to film it all and document it. I loved my Mark III, and really hopefully the improvements on this Mark IV here are worth it. Thanks again to all of you who made it this far through the video or through the series. And if you think I earned it, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.